Hello, I'm Bert Tosh, and this is something of a substitute for the Society's field trip, which hasn't happened for the past 2 years. We're looking at some aspects of Presbyterianism in Belfast, for we couldn't tell the whole story in the time we have. Many important things will be left out. We're beginning here in the First Presbyterian Church in Rosemary Street. In 1642, the Rev Dr Bert, a chaplain in General Monro's Scottish Army, one of the first members of the Presbytery founded in Carrick in 1642, was instructed to preach every third Sunday in Belfast to the members of his regiment. The first minister of the newly formed congregation in 1646 was a Scot, Anthony Shaw. He ministered in turbulent times, a strong supporter of the Covenants. He had little time for Cromwell and fled to Scotland when the parliamentary forces took control of the town in 1649. He became a parish minister in Ayrshire. There doesn't seem to have been a Presbyterian minister in Belfast during the time of the Commonwealth, although there was a parliamentary preacher, his stipend paid by the government. This was one Essex Digby, who'd been a rector in County Kildare. It is, as Professor Raymond Gillespie says, probably no coincidence that he was a nephew of Lady Donegal, the second wife of Arthur Chichester, the first Earl of Donegal, the local landowner. Digby later became Bishop of Dromore, and in 1660, with the fall of the Commonwealth, an Englishman, William Keys, became minister. He'd moved here from Camas or Strabane, where he had been for a short time. Probably because he was English, he was one of 2 ministers sent to London to congratulate Charles II on his restoration and to plead the Presbyterian cause. The king assured them of protection, but it was an empty promise. For with the appointment of bishops to the restored Church of Ireland in 1661, Keys was one of 61 church ministers ejected from their positions. In 1663, he and a number of others were imprisoned for alleged implication in what Professor Finlay Holmes called the bizarre episode of Blood's plot, when the English soldier Thomas Blood planned to seize Dublin Castle. Keys was released, returned to Belfast, where he seems to have had a reasonably untroubled life, probably because the third Lady Donegal held him in high regard. His congregation had a meeting house in North Street, near the North Gate, in the ramparts built to protect the town in the 1640s. In 1673, Keys was instructed to accept a call to Bull Alley Church near St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, despite the protests of his Belfast congregation and of Lady Donegal. The following year, Patrick Adair, after nearly 30 years ministering in Cairncastle, was installed in Belfast. He led a deputation which presented King William with an address when the monarch arrived in Belfast en route to the Boyne. But Adair is chiefly remembered for his narrative, on which subsequent Presbyterian historians have been heavily dependent. Although some relationship with the Donegals was maintained, Lady Donegal wasn't over fond of Scots, and so she invited English Presbyterians to be her chaplains. One was Thomas Emlyn, who later, when he was in Dublin in Wood Street Church, admitted he was an Arian, believing that the son had been created by the father and was so inferior to him, and he was removed from his post and imprisoned. Adair died in 1694, and John McBride became minister. And at this time, there was an influx of Scots into Ulster during the 1690s, and the congregation grew and moved to its present site in what was then Rosemary Lane, but not to this present building. The early years of the next century were particularly difficult for Irish Presbyterianism, which had no legal standing at the time, although a Toleration Act was finally passed in 1719. McBride contributed to controversy about the validity of Christian marriages. In his pamphlet, A Vindication of Marriage as Solemnized by Presbyterians in the North of Ireland. 2 years later, the Irish Parliament passed a Test Act stating that anyone holding civic or military office had to receive the sacrament in the Church of Ireland. As a result, 8 Presbyterian members of Belfast Corporation were removed, but not until 1708. And in the wake of the passing of the Test Act, the issue of Presbyterian loyalty was raised. William Tisdale in 1709, he was a friend of Swift, and in 1712 became the splenetic vicar of Belfast, as Professor Ian McBride describes him. Tisdale published a sample of true blue Presbyterian loyalty in all changes and turns of government. He argued that Presbyterians were at heart rebellious and revolutionary in all circumstances. McBride replied in his A Sample of Jet Black Prelatic Calumny, which maybe gives some idea of the tone of the debate. McBride narrowly escaped arrest when he was one of about half a dozen ministers who refused to take an abjuration oath, denying any claim of James Edward Stuart, later the Old Pretender, to be the throne of England. Now, McBride was no Jacobite. His refusal arose from his belief that taking the oath recognised the established church, and the wording implied that James Edward was not the legitimate son of James II. He fled to Scotland as well and remained for some years, and in his absence, James Kirkpatrick of Templepatrick was installed in 1708 as McBride's colleague. By this time, the congregation had about 2,500 members, and when McBride returned, a second congregation in 1708 with Kirkpatrick as minister was formed, and the meeting house was erected somewhere behind the existing building. A 1715 map of Belfast shows two buildings side by side, both two-storied. Each seems to have a tower, which was unlikely. They were probably T-shaped. Now, both were rebuilt later in the century. 1783, the first congregation obtained this elliptical building designed by Roger Mulholland, although the original facade was replaced in the 1830s, and the newer work, I think, lacked something of the graceful elegance of the original. John Wesley, who preached here in June 1789, just before his 86th birthday, described it as the completest place of worship he had ever seen, and beautiful in the highest degree. The same year, the second church was replaced by a larger building. In 1806, the second church became the first Presbyterian church in Ireland to have an organ, with Edward Bunting, the famous collector of traditional melodies, as the organist. Bunting had encouraged the first church to have an organ, but they wouldn't have one. And they weren't too happy at the thought of the second church having an organ either, because they argued that the noise of the organ and the singing would distract them from their worship in first church. They even suggested that times of worship might have to be changed, but the matter was somehow amicably agreed. Another congregation was soon to be formed nearby, Third Belfast, or Rosemary Street as it became known. The reason was largely theological. James Kirkpatrick of Second Belfast was a leading member of the Belfast Society, which had been formed in 1705 and was made up of ministers who discussed matters of theological and intellectual interest. In 1719, another member, John Abernethy of Antrim, published a sermon arguing for freedom of conscience and rejecting any idea of a statement of belief being imposed by church courts, a clear reference to the injunction on ministers to subscribe the Westminster Confession of Faith. A controversy lasting some 7 years began and produced about 50 pamphlets from both sides. First into the field was John Malcolm, the minister of Dunmurry, who accused Abernethy and his colleagues of trying to introduce new light by replacing government within the church with personal opinion. The term new light came to be applied to the non-subscribers, while the traditional Calvinists were called old light. New lights were moderate, ready to consider fresh opinions, not wedded to traditional Calvinism, and tended to preach morality and virtue, while old lights were committed Calvinists, suspicious of unfamiliar thinking and determined to preach dogmatically. The 1720 meeting of the General Synod passed a Pacific Act, which, while insisting on subscription, allowed anyone who had concerns about parts of the confession to use his own expressions, subject to Presbyterian agreement. But the following year, when Samuel Halliday was installed in First Belfast, he refused to describe the confession. But the installation went ahead and the General Synod approved. Now, most Presbyterian histories only refer to Halliday's part in the controversy, but Dr. David Steers, in a recently published booklet, recounts a fascinating life before he was called to Belfast. Many members of the two Belfast congregations were unhappy with the ideas and the ministries of Halliday and Kirkpatrick. They sought Synod's approval to have another church erected because, as they put it, of the numerousness of the congregation and as a means to make the gospel more successful. Despite opposition from Halliday and Kirkpatrick, their appeal was granted. Funds were raised in Scotland, and the new church opened in 1723, just down the street, with Charles Masterton of Connor in County Antrim, a very strong subscriber, as minister. The original building was described as being devoid of all external ornament. This was replaced by a more imposing erection in 1832 when the Rev Dr Samuel Hannah was minister, and Hannah became the first moderator of the General Assembly in 1640 when the General and Secession Synods united in Rosemary Street Church. Meanwhile, the subscription controversy rumbled on. In 1725, the Synod reorganised the presbyteries of the church with the non-subscribing ministers in the Presbytery of Antrim. But the following year there was separation. But it was far from a complete break, and new light ideas certainly didn't disappear from the Synod of Ulster, in which Third Belfast was a member, but the first and second congregations were part of the Presbytery of Antrim. Although, curiously enough, Kirkpatrick's immediate successors, Gilbert Kennedy and Patrick Bryson, retained their membership of the General Synod. Bryson, an Irish language scholar, seems to have had something of a fallout with the congregation, and with some of the members moved to a new building in Donegal Street in 1791. Of the three churches in Rosemary Street, this is the only survivor. The second congregation moved to Elmwood Avenue in 1896 to All Souls Church, and its building behind this one was demolished amid some controversy in the 1960s to make a car park. The third congregation's building was destroyed in the Belfast Blitz in 1941, with its congregation moving to the northern suburbs, but retaining the name Rosemary. Belfast was something of a cockpit of political activity among Presbyterians during the last years of the 18th century. Before the Test Act was repealed in 1780, Presbyterians were in effect second-class citizens. The rise of the volunteers gave them a place in political and civic life. The volunteers were set up in 1778 during the American War of Independence, when the ship Ranger appeared off Carrickfergus and captured a Royal Navy vessel. There was panic. The volunteers were formed for defence in the face of possible invasion by the French, America's allies. Many Presbyterians, including a number of ministers, joined. Sinclair Kelburn of Third Belfast is supposed to have preached in his volunteer uniform, accompanied with his musket in the pulpit. But the volunteers also sought reform of the Irish Parliament and its legislative independence from Westminster, and expressed pleasure at the relaxation of penal laws against Roman Catholics, although they did not all agree on what rights Catholics should have. Many in Belfast, for example, believed there should be no restrictions on them. In 1783, the first Belfast Company of Volunteers admitted Catholics. And the following May, under Captain Waddell Cunningham, a member of 2nd Belfast, the man who unsuccessfully tried to involve Belfast in the slave trade, allegedly, along with his members in full uniform, provided a guard of honour at the opening of St Mary's Church in Chapeldean, the first Catholic church in the town of Belfast. But there were divisions between those who sought immediate reform and others who thought it should be a gradual process. The more radical were involved in 1791 in forming the Society of United Irishmen in Peggy Barclay's Tavern in Sugarhouse Entry, off High Street, not far from this building. While Wolfe Tones is a name usually associated with United Irishmen, it seems the real brain behind the society was Dr. William Drennan, the son of Thomas Drennan, the minister here from 1736 until 1768. His plans included parliamentary reform, Catholics and Presbyterians uniting to overthrow the Protestant ascendancy, and implicit in this was an idea of greater separation from Britain. Most of the founders of the society could be described as middle-class Presbyterian merchants, like Samuel Neilson, the son of the minister in Ballyroney, a woolen draper. In early 1792, he became editor of the Northern Star, a paper with a circulation of about 4,000, and a number of ministers like Kelburn regularly contributed. But when it became clear in 1795 the Irish Parliament would not accept reform or support Catholic emancipation, the chances of rebellion increased. The government became alarmed. In 1796, in April, the Reverend Sinclair Kelburn was charged with treason and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail. He was never tried, but he lost the use of his limbs in custody. And later he was joined by some of the other United Irish leaders. Now, the rebellion in Antrim and Down came in the summer of '98. It was an abject failure, and recriminations were great. Henry Joy McCracken, a member of 3rd Belfast, was the commander of the Antrim rebels, having hastily been appointed when the designated commander took cold feet about the whole affair. After his capture, McCracken was tried and executed in High Street. Now, while most of the Ulster rebels were Presbyterians, and there may have been some sympathy for United Irish aims, support of the rebellion was far from universal among Presbyterians. William Bruce of First Belfast was a leading New Light minister with very liberal theological opinions. In 1798, he joined a yeomanry company in Belfast, and according to A.T.Q. Stewart, was the last sentry seen by General Nugent's force as it left Belfast, crossing the long bridge over the River Lagan into County Down on the way to crush the rebels at Ballynahinch. Now, large numbers of Presbyterians have been traumatised by the rebellion and its aftermath. And that trauma was accompanied by a growing sense of disillusionment in any idea that reform could be achieved by violent means. But the 19th century was to see considerable change in Irish Presbyterianism and also in the Irish political scene. The theological complexion of the General Synod altered considerably with the growth of evangelicalism. And Belfast grew enormously during the century, which provided its own challenge in meeting spiritual needs. A new congregation was formed in Fisherwick Place in 1824 and May Street 5 years later. May Street Church was built for this man, Henry Cook. A number of people thought he should have been called to Fisherwick Place. When that didn't happen, steps were taken to build this church, where he ministered until his death in 1868. Now, many words have been said and written about Cook. I'll resist temptation and say very little. He's remembered for his crusade against Arianism in the Synod of Ulster, which led to the withdrawal of some ministers to form the Remonstrant Synod, which later united with the Presbytery of Antrim to form the non-subscribing Presbyterian Church. Now, while many of Cook's fellow ministers supported his theological activism, they weren't happy with his political position. He was a Tory and was very pleased to have close relationships with aristocratic members of the ascendancy. He was, and still is, a controversial figure, but maybe the last word should be left to Professor John Barclay. Cook, he said, is the type of historical character who creates either great admiration or just as great aversion. But taking an objective view, while one may not approve of his every action, he was an outstanding figure in 19th century Irish Presbyterianism and a distinguished leader. In 1821, Belfast's population was just over 37,000 people. It reached 200 By 1881, 30 years later, it was 350,000, a tenfold increase, due largely to industrial growth, particularly linen production and shipbuilding. In 1821, there were 9 congregations belonging to 5 different Presbyterian bodies, 2 both in Rosemary Street, were part of the non-subscribing Presbytery of Antrim. Another 2 belonged to the Synod of Ulster, Rosemary Street, or 3rd Belfast, and Donegal Street. The Secession Synod had 2 in Alfred Street and Linnenhall Street. The Reformed Presbyterians 1, also in Linnenhall Street, and it had been founded in 1808, while there was 1 church attached to the Associate Presbytery, established by James Bryce in 1816 in protest at certain aspects of the payment of regium donum, the government grant to ministers. It was a very different picture 90 years later, in 1911. By then, there were 4 non-subscribing churches, 5 Reformed Presbyterians. The Associate Presbytery congregation was now, believe it or not, part of the United Free Church of Scotland, and there were 52 congregations connected to the General Assembly, and some had moved from downtown locations. 2 moved to the university area, which became well supplied with Presbyterian churches within a short walk of Queen's. In 1872, Alfred Street Church moved to Fitzroy Avenue behind Queen's, despite Elmwood, opposite Queen's, having been opened in 1861. And then in 1887, Linnenhall Street moved to Crescent Church down the road from Queen's. 2nd Belfast, the non-subscribing congregation, had gone to Elmwood Avenue. And Fisherwick Place Church left the centre of Belfast when its site was purchased by the General Assembly to build Church House. It moved to the Lower Malone Road. Now, Elmwood closed in 1971 and was purchased by Queen's University. Crescent now houses a Christian Brethren Assembly. Not that provision in other parts of Belfast was so lavish. It was estimated that to meet the needs, the Presbyterian Church required a new congregation every year, and even that would hardly have been sufficient. In 1910, the Belfast Presbytery carried out a census. One question was about the number of families connected or unconnected with a congregation in the parish area. There was variation. Belmont stated that in its parish it had 304 connected families and 28 unconnected values, while Newton Breda proudly claimed its parish had 484 Presbyterian families, every one connected. These were both in the middle-class suburbs. By contrast, Westbourne, near the Belfast shipyard, had 250 families connected, 271 not, while its near neighbour, McGain Memorial, claimed figures of 390 connected and 512 not. In many places, at least a third of Presbyterian families do not seem to have had any connection, for the church was clearly losing touch with many in the urban working class, a situation far from peculiar to Belfast or to Presbyterianism during the Victorian era. As far back as 1857, the Belfast Town Mission had been founded to reach out to the poor and the unchurched. It became the Belfast City Mission after Belfast was granted city status. Initially, it was interdenominational, but became connected to the General Assembly in 1843. It established a series of mission halls, usually linked to a local congregation, although there was often a consciousness of social division between church and hall. Professor Finlay Holmes states that the City Mission was a monument to the failure of congregations to meet the needs of many of Belfast's citizens. He ascribes the reason as to why many people who worked long hours in difficult conditions did not attend church to the image of middle-class respectability, which the churches acquired, the intellectual presentation of the faith in long sermons, the identification of the churches with employers rather than employees. In 1853, a joint enterprise between the first and second congregations formed the Belfast Domestic Mission to meet the needs of the poorest. It had premises at first near Divis Street, then in Donegal Street. Schools were set up, grants for the essentials of life were made available to many people. Many General Assembly congregations did make efforts to reach out to the unchurched. some with their own mission halls. The Rev Dr Henry Montgomery, the minister of Albert Street, established a tent mission on the Shankill Road. In 1898, a new purpose-built centre was erected, the Shankill Road Mission, with a hall seating 2,000 people, along with a soup kitchen, medical facilities, classrooms, and recreation space. Montgomery resigned from Albert Street in 1902 to work full-time with the mission, which became a congregation 5 years later. And that brings us to the 20th century and to its challenges. Many outside the control of Presbyterians, some which had truly global effects. A crisis over human rule, 2 world wars, the partition of Ireland, the depression of the 1930s, and in the last 30 years of the century, political upheaval and considerable violence. And in the background, a gradual but accelerating decline in religious belief. The Presbyterian Church in Ireland entered the new century with the erection of a large building in the centre of Belfast. Church House and its Assembly Hall provided offices for the church, a meeting place for the General Assembly. It was opened in 1905 by the Duke of Argyll, a son-in-law of Queen Victoria. It cost some £75,000, and the Duke remarked the erection was better suited to its purpose than any other building he had seen. Now, I'm here in the Assembly Hall, originally with 2 galleries, but during the 1990s it was remodelled, the whole building, and the ground floor was raised a storey and a shopping mall, now used for meeting spaces, created underneath. After the First World War, with a huge loss of life, not least at the Somme, which cast a shadow over the life of Ulster for a long time, the General Assembly decided to create a memorial to all Presbyterians who died in the war. This was the Presbyterian War Memorial Hostel, usually the Presbyterian Hostel, just across Howard Street from this building. Opened in 1926, it provided suitable accommodation for young women and men who came to study or work in Belfast. The purpose was amply fulfilled, and indeed, in the early 1960s, an extension was built around the corner in Brunswick Street, but soon afterwards the centre of Belfast became the target of frequent bombings, and that threat to the residents, along with more and more young people not being particularly happy with hostel accommodation, led to the closure, and the assets were used to provide a hall of residence for university students. The number of new congregations formed had fallen since the beginning of the 20th century. But new housing in Belfast after World War I in the 1920s and 30s led to 7 congregations being founded between 1930 and 39. Apart from Mersey Street in inner East Belfast, the others were in the Belfast suburbs, though most had to wait until the 50s for their church buildings because of World War II and a post-war shortage of materials. In World War II, the Luftwaffe bombed Belfast 3 times in April and May 1941. Over 1,000 people were killed. A number of churches of different denominations were destroyed. 6 belonged to the General Assembly: McCrory Memorial, Newington, Crumlin Road, Clifton Street, and York Street, all in the north of the city, and Rosemary Street, as I've already said, in the centre. The first 3 were rebuilt after the war, the others united with existing congregations. York Street, non-subscribing church, was also totally destroyed. Its congregation went to All Souls in Elmwood Avenue. And Trinity Street Reformed Presbyterian Church was so badly damaged, it met in the hall of the nearby St. Enoch's Presbyterian Church, and indeed when a new minister was installed, that service took place in St. Enoch's. There was considerable disruption to those congregations in or near the most damaged areas. St. Enoch's itself lost almost 100 families in less than 2 years. By the end of 1941, Sunday school attendance had halved. But the Blitz also brought into full public view the absolutely appalling conditions in which many of Belfast citizens had to live. The moderator of the General Assembly expressed his shock at the sight of the people he saw walking the streets. He said he'd never seen the like of them before. Wretched people, undersized, underfed, down and out looking men and women. I fancy he wouldn't have been the only Presbyterian unaware of the condition of many of his fellow citizens. After World War II, there was again a massive program of public and private house building. So between 1950 and 1968, about 16 congregations were formed in the greater Belfast area, many of them growing at a rate which we would now find surprising. But this was unfortunately only a prelude to what was going to cause major problems for Presbyterianism in Belfast, the Troubles. Quite apart from the huge pain and suffering for individual Presbyterians, congregational life was badly damaged in many places. Evening meetings were for a time at least abandoned in areas where violence was common. Unrest in the streets and frequent transport problems made it particularly hard for weekday activities and sometimes Sunday worship, especially for downtown congregations. May Street, in the heart of Belfast, in 1968 claimed 515 families scattered throughout the city and beyond. In 1979, the figure was 215. Thousands of people in Belfast moved house during the Troubles, especially in the earlier years, in what Jonathan Barton has described as the biggest enforced movement of population in Europe since 1945. There were many reasons for this. People were intimidated or afraid of being intimidated. Members of the security force would be advised to relocate, and when they moved, others followed. People wanted to get away from areas where violence was common. And others, I suspect, moved because they felt safer when surrounded by their co-religionists. But as Presbyterian families left an area or died, the vacant property was left and the chances of other Presbyterians moving in were slim. This all had a considerable effect. 2 church extension charges had to close. The overall numbers tell their own story. There was a 35% decrease in Presbyterian families in the 3 Belfast presbyteries over 20 years. In East Belfast, it was 25%. In North Belfast, 34%. In South Belfast, 58%, almost half. The greater part of the decrease occurred between 68 and 78, but decline continued. Now, it would be wrong to attribute all this entirely to the Troubles, but there were also a number of redevelopment schemes in the city, demolishing streets of tightly packed terrace housings, and indeed leaving some areas with few dwelling houses at all. And this too disrupted a number of congregations. Belfast was no longer what many had described as a Presbyterian city. By 1973, around 8 congregations had closed or entered unions to be replaced by 3. But in 1976, the General Assembly Committee concluded there were too many large church buildings in the wrong places, and proposals for a degree of rationalisation had to be dropped, largely because of indifference or reluctance to change or consider porting to a new location, although Cliftonville Church moved to Newton Abbey in the 70s, as did Trinity Street Reformed Presbyterian. But compared to more than 50 congregations listed in 1968, North and South Belfast, almost 2/5 were no longer in existence some 50 years later. Some were demolished. A few found other uses, like Duncairn and the Antrim Road, now an arts centre, or Broadway and the Falls Road, now Culterlan McAdam O'Feach, named after Robert Shipboy McAdam, a 19th century member of Second Belfast with a keen interest in the Irish language, and Cardinal Thomas O'Feach, the Archbishop of Armagh. Now, had the Troubles never happened, had there been no redevelopment, some congregations, I think, would still have struggled for survival. It is, thank goodness, not my role to predict what the future of Presbyterianism in Belfast will be. It's been here for nearly 400 years, and I've little doubt it will continue in some shape or form.